Welcome to In This Together, the Twinkl Wellbeing podcast, the place where we explore all things wellbeing in education. Join us as we dive into honest conversations, share practical strategies, and uncover the insights you need to foster a thriving environment for both staff, students, and everyone in their lives. Get ready to feel inspired, supported, and ready to make a real difference in your school community. My name's Becky Dawson and I'm the National Wellbeing Lead here at Twinkl, and my co-host is the brilliant Liba Sheikh, a passionate mental health advocate, psychology student and all-round inspiration.
We would love to hear from you. Got a question about something you heard or a comment you'd like to share? Maybe you even have a fantastic example of well-being in action. Whatever it is, drop us a line at teamwellbeing@twinkl.co.uk. We can't wait to hear from you.
Today we are joined by the wonderful Tracey Campbell. She is a behaviour management consultant, trainer, advanced skills teacher, keynote speaker, coach and author of Will You Be the One? Good afternoon, Tracey.
Good afternoon, Becky. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
We are absolutely thrilled to have you here. So for each of our episodes, we have kind of an overarching question, and today's question has already started some controversy, Tracey. So I put it together. It was, does behaviour management need a radical change? Liba, would you like to come in at this point and share with Tracey your thoughts on the term behaviour management?
So I come from a lived experience background where I've been so the nicest way to say it, I was quite a naughty child in school, kept getting excluded. The way I believe the reason why was because my school tried to manage my behavior rather than give me the control to manage my own behavior. It almost felt like I wasn't in control. And the management they were trying to do on my behavior was just a trauma response. So why are they trying to manage my trauma response rather than giving me support? So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about the term behavior management. Do you think maybe more trauma-informed work would be more appropriate?
Yeah, very interesting thing to start with. I mean, you guys have gone right in there, and this is good. This is good. So let me first of all say, behavior management is a term that I use, in my work. And it's definitely, when you talk about that language causing controversy, I've heard some of that controversy. And I think some of the arguments that are posed are very, very valid arguments. They are legitimate arguments, And if I'm honest, I think it's appropriate for me to say it's a term. I'm not entirely comfortable with the term behavior management. I think I haven't quite worked out what to say instead. So I've stayed with it for the time being because it has connotations, much of what has just been unpacked. This idea, and, Becky, you and I will talk about the kind of two sides of the behavior coin thing, It has this idea of the responsibility being placed on the child to, manage very, very big emotions. And it has an undertone of control. It has an undertone that can feel lacking in compassion. It can feel cold. It can feel as if that the adult's objective is just to make the behavior stop rather than have that posture of curiosity. So I've got a friend of mine, an associate of mine actually, who uses the term behavior leadership. And I more so lean on the term behavior responses, because my belief is, as adults, and you will know this, Becky, from our conversations, I don't talk about behavior without talking about the behavior of adults and children, So I think the issue for me in my work is by the time I'm using the language of behavior management, people know what I mean. And it's contextualized. People understand that I'm very much in favor of a trauma-informed approach. I'm very much in favor. And I mean, I make no apology for the fact that when I stand on a platform of any description to talk about behavior, I would like to think I spend as much time talking about adults as I do about children. So I hear those concerns. I think those concerns are valid. And what I would say is definitely in the education behavior management space, people are trying to find a reasonable alternative to that phrase. But I think when I use that phrase in training or in my correspondence, this is with people who understand our ethos. They understand our mission. And if I'm honest, Labour, this has been a helpful prompt for me to actually go a little bit further in saying, is it now the time to actually think about an alternative phraseology that speaks of the way we practice, which is trauma-informed, very, very much encouraging practitioners. Let's be curious. about what is happening. Let's assume that posture of care and compassion. So yeah, maybe this is the time. I'm prepared to take that one on the chin. Absolutely. 100%.
Liber challenging from the outset. That's why she's here. But I think the challenge is also people understand what the term behaviour management means. That's a shortcut, isn't it? It's something in education that everyone recognises. And like you say, once the work starts, it's all about the trauma informed. And actually tell us about those two sides of the coin that you mentioned around adults and children.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I found in my work, which has spanned, I mean, I've been in education for 30 years and more so in the kind of, consultancy role for around about 15 years. And it's really interesting sometimes when I show up, to deliver training or I'm engaging, with schools around behaviour. Sometimes people want a bit of a clinic, it's doctor, this child keeps shouting out, how can I make it stop? It's a bit like what kind of Libra's alluding to, Some of these responses are trauma responses. So it isn't just about how can I shut it down? Just make it stop. I have a phrase where I say, I like to give people something for the heart before I put something in their hands. And I take that really seriously. I think people have to really understand when it comes to responding to behavior, it's not clinical. It's not cold. It's not emotionless. And we cannot engage in a conversation or in a consultation, in a training session without first of all looking at the first side of the coin is me. It's me management. It's how do I respond? And I think in training, I refer to that as the behavior cycle. And the behavior cycle is a student will do something. And that thing can be positive or negative, right? Because behavior, that's another thing. Behavior is not negative. Behavior is neutral, right? So that we can make choices either way. But the truth is, we respond. And we can respond in a way that puts water on a fire, or we can respond in a way that puts petrol on a fire. So the two sides of the behavior coin that I allude to is the fact that we must have conversations about how adults respond to behavior and how children behave in the first instance. We have to talk about those two things. And if I'm honest with you, Becky, sometimes that's missing from the discourse. It is very much focused on, children who developmentally are still on the journey of understanding, how to navigate sometimes really strong emotions that they don't have the language for. And so I do think, and to go back to your earlier question, is there a need for a radical change? I mean, the answer is a resounding yes, because, the themes that I'm seeing coming through in my work and the questions that are being asked about the complexities of needs that we're having to confront and try to work with in mainstream schools, much less specialist provisions, we can't, if punishment was going to work, let's be honest, it would have worked when it was corporal punishment, right? I mean, does it get any worse than that? And yet we're still here talking about the complexities of needs and the increase in the number of, students needing to access, special educational needs services and so on and so forth. So it does need a radical overhaul. And I think a big part of that for me is about increasing the capacity of adults in schools to understand what is going on when a student, primary, secondary, even college age student, is exhibiting a particular type of behavior that persists. So in my conversations about behavior, I kind of talk about three groups. And I talk about the perfect student, who is the one we're probably not thinking about right now. And I put perfect in inverted commas because you and I know no student is perfect, right? But I just use that for ease. And they're the ones who, 9 times out of 10, they're doing the right thing. They're the ones who very, very quickly become the invisible students because they don't get praised for doing the right thing and they're not doing the wrong thing, so nobody's worried about it, right? So they're the perfect students. And then you've got the predictable students, and they're students who just behave like students. They behave like young people, some good days, some bad days. Sometimes they tell a little white lie. Sometimes they take responsibility. They behave like your typical kind of child, right? But then you've got the ones whose behavior persists. So you've got the perfect, the predictable, and then the persistent. And they're the ones that make us pull our hair out. They're the ones that keep us up at night. And I just think when it comes to that latter group, they need hope and they need help. Because when behavior starts to persist now, there's a reason. The behaviors become purposeful. The behaviors become functional. It was lovely to hear, Liba start with her own story. I had issues with my behavior at school, and I did as well, right? 5 times excluded or certainly suspended from secondary school, once from primary school. And that whole experience, as I'm sure it has Libra's work, it informs the way that you show up now as a professional. You know, you don't want other young people to have the experiences that I had, where I did feel like the intention was just to crush me. The intention was to shut me down, shut me up, you know. And yeah, in some instances it was damaging, but it hardened me. That's how I was affected. You know, it made me really question the extent to which I could trust adults. So yeah, those two sides of the coin is really important for me. We need to think about how we practice, how we can increase the capacity of staff to be able to meet the demands, you know, of the kind of 21st century classroom as we found it now. And then the other side of the coin is really seeing students not as problems, but as people. I think, you know, and I speak as a teacher, you know, I was a teacher by profession for many years, both in mainstream and alternative provision. So I don't speak as somebody who is ignorant of the challenges and how de-skilled you can feel when you are an experienced teacher and you've all of a sudden found yourself in a class where you're like, whoa, like, what do I do with this? I think there is I really want to acknowledge that quite pointedly, that my heart is warm, you know, to teachers in the profession and to leaders, because we're in a very difficult time. But I do believe that the way forward it's much more kind of compassion laden than I think we are prepared for, if I'm honest. So yeah.
That's really interesting. And as you were talking, I was thinking of a class that I had in my last year of mainstream teaching that really challenged me, really made me feel like, have I been doing this for 16 years? I had them period 5 on a Friday in the dance studio because it was a drama lesson. There were 30 of them, and individually they were lovely, but together there was some challenges, and it did make me think, have I learned anything about teaching in these years? And it can be really tough. And I think, yeah, we don't underestimate how difficult it is for people out there doing this day in and day out, which is why it's so important for people like you, Tracey, who have been there, to be talking about this. Quite often we can get people espousing what they think we should be doing in this space who haven't set foot in a classroom, and that can be a challenge, can't it?
I think it's quite powerful that you come from a lived experience perspective when you're doing the work you're doing, because you've also experienced school exclusion, which I think is quite powerful. What I'm interested in, you said something about, do you think that about schools needing to adapt to 21st century classroom? How do you think 21st century classroom is different to the classrooms we've had before? What are the main differences now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think when I was in the classrooms as a child, I'm in the classroom as a child, I'm not really cognizant of what's going on around me in the way that I am now, right? So my memory is that I don't recall there being the complexity of need that we're seeing now. There may well have been adults who were there then, may have a different view, yeah? So I definitely have a memory of being, and I'm talking from primary, being a bit of an anomaly, being, you know, on an outlier, as it were. One of, and even if you were, I'm sitting here now thinking, who are the other, you know, naughty children? And I can't think of them because I think I took up all that space. So I think comparatively, and maybe part of it may be why the needs were not as pronounced, is because of the way it was dealt with. You know, you misbehaved at your peril. You know, there was some swift, harsh, you know, sanctions that were going to come your way, and some of them, you know, I remember being in the school play and turning up on the day of the production and being told my part was given to somebody else. You know, on the day, like, I've dressed, I'm ready for action. Oliver Twist, I'll never forget it. I was Fagin in the play, and I arrived on the day. So, you know, the tactics, and I'm going to call them tactics that were used, were really cold and harsh and abrasive. So I think what we're dealing with now is, and, you know, we're in this technological age where, you know, one of the arguments at the moment is, you know, about students, you know, young people's capacity to kind of understand, read and respond to their own emotions. But we're living in a technological age now where the expectation on them to even engage at a human level is significantly diminished than when we were in school. So we're up against that as a challenge. So, that affects not just behavior, but the level of engagement that students can sustain when they are in the classroom, because they are in, the kind of multimedia generation that has never known anything except, bright lights, things moving on the screen and kind of excitement and interaction, right? So I think it's a very, very different kettle of fish, whether that's about tech, whether that's about the complexity and the sheer volume, the number of students who are, and I think it's twofold. It's the volume, as in the number of students who are needing to use these external services, and the complexity of what is being presented, in terms of the behavior itself. So in response to the question, I definitely think it's almost like night and day in terms of what we're up against. But what I will say is, there's a keynote that I deliver, and I think it's called Some Things Never Change. And the reason why I call it that is because education is one of those sectors, right, where it can feel like, and Becky, you'd appreciate this as a former teacher, you've just got your head around something, international primary curriculum, for argument's sake. You just got it under your belt. And before you know it, it's out. It's old news, something else has come in, right? And it definitely felt for me as a teacher like it was a conveyor belt of new initiatives. And one of the things I say when I'm doing that keynote is some things never change, and they shouldn't. There are some things that can seem too simple to be significant. And so when we talk about relational practice and restorative practice, I mean, we didn't call it restorative practice back in the day, right? But ultimately it's relational practice, and it's the importance of those relationships. Those things have not changed. If we had time on this podcast right now to kind of go back in our own memory bank and talk about adults that we remember for all the right reasons, we would be talking about relationship. We would be talking about people who listened. We would be talking about people who made us feel safe. We would be talking about people who advocated for us. And sometimes whether it's keynoting or training, it almost feels as like people are waiting to hear that new thing. What is it? What's the silver bullet? It's that thing that, do you understand what I mean? And I say to them, listen, in many respects, and this is in some ways an answer to Liba's question, some things haven't changed. Some things have changed drastically. But if we're talking about what are the fundamental things that make an impact, at the very least create an access point for you to begin to make a connection with you. And I know it's people, when I think about my teacher, who was the one for me, she gave me a sense that I was more than my behavior. I didn't feel like a problem to her. I felt like a real person that found things difficult, that made the wrong decision on occasions, that needed to be held to account, that had to adhere to boundaries. Yeah. But I felt loved by her. I felt that she met me where I was, but she didn't want to leave me there. And I think that is the thing that we need to catch. That on the one hand, people can wax lyrical about the complexities of the sector as it stands, but it's almost as if we don't ask the question then, okay, so how do we need to practice to respond? What is the right response to the issues that are on the table currently? So I hope, Liba, that's an answer to your question. A lot has changed, but in terms of the way that adults need to respond, certainly as a starting point, yeah, I think some of that connection, relationship, safety, advocacy, it can seem too simple to be significant.
And there's so much research to tell us that actually those relationships are crucial. It's not just Tracey and I saying it because we've seen it in schools. There's a huge amount of research around resilience and around that power of the person that can make a difference because they have taken the time to get to know a young person, to meet them where they're at. And we've talked a lot about kind of staff-student relationships, but let's think a little bit about how do we create an ethos around this in the school, because that's a real challenge. And quite often, we've talked before about the disconnect between the ethos school leaders think they've created around behaviour and relationships and what children, young people and staff are actually experiencing. Why do you think there's that kind of breakdown, and what impact does that have?
Yeah, so in response to the question about why there is a breakdown, if I'm honest, I think sometimes leaders have inherited an ethos, a set of values, a mission statement that hasn't really been given much thought I joined this school however many years ago. Our core values are resilience, respect, care, love, whatever you want to call it. And so there hasn't been that evaluation, that real kind of, let's really look at who we are. What is our distinction as a school? And the way that I frame it in my work is what do we value? What do we prize? And even before we think about what we value, I encourage leaders to think about vision. Like, what is that picture of a preferred future for our entire school community? Vision, yeah? And then because of where we're trying to get to, if you imagine you or I don't know, I live in the north of London, yeah? So, if I wanted to get to Angel Islington, there, I can get on the number 4. It takes me straight to Angel Islington, right? So I know when I get on that bus, I'm going to that destination, yeah? And in some ways, the values tells your school community, because of where we're going, these are the things that are uppermost for us. That when you signed up to be a part of this team, when you as a parent said you're sending your child here, this is the stated direction of travel. We're going to Angel. We believe in respect. We believe in, tolerance or inclusion, right? So the vision piece for me is central. Then the second thing is values. Because of where we're going, these things are important. These are the things that are uppermost for us. If you go to the school down the road, it might be slightly different. For us, these are the things that we prize. And sometimes there just hasn't been that thinking about the vision and the values as a separate piece. Then when you begin to link vision and values with behavior, it's so interesting, Becky, that sometimes people haven't made that link. That if we are a school who prizes, let's just say, tolerance, inclusion, and respect, what does that mean for our code of conduct? What does that mean for the expectations, or whatever you want to call them, the expectations, the agreements, the rules? Because those are the things, that's what I'm going to give you. If we imagine, Becky, you're on a team in that particular school, that's the thing that you're going to carry around with you, so to speak. It's adults bring that vision to life in their practice. Yeah. So I think part of the problem is, people have inherited sometimes an ethos, a mission statement that it hasn't been revisited. It hasn't been refreshed. It hasn't been looked at through new eyes, sometimes for very legitimate reasons. I could imagine, maybe I can't imagine. I've never been a head teacher. So I don't know what it's like when you've started that new role and the whole, plethora of things that you've got to worry about, right? But then sometimes that work has been done, but then there hasn't been the link to behavior, because the behavior piece should answer the so what question. So we're going, and this is our vision. Okay, these are the things we prize. So what? So the behavior policy or the expectations or the rules or the agreements are how you answer the so what questions. Because we prize these things, this is how we will conduct ourselves here, And so sometimes when I go into schools and I do a behavior review, and part of that review is testing those things that we've just talked about. I test, the vision, and I test the values, and I test it by asking questions. I ask questions to the staff. So we survey the team. We survey sometimes depending on the, how broad the team wants to go with the work, but sometimes we survey governors like parents. It's all the key stakeholders, right? And it always gets interesting when you get down to the students, because, I was in a school recently and doing a piece of work around their policy, and they had 3 core values, met with the student panel, and we're bouncing around these 3 values, and none of them had any idea. They just thought it was language that I pulled out of the hat. They had no idea. And I'm talking from year 11 all the way down, they had no idea it had anything to do with their school's core values. So there is often that what I call the ethos that is expressed at leadership level, and the ethos that people experience on the ground. And there are massive implications, Becky, if I'm honest, because there's no website that I've logged onto, there's no prospectus that I've read that says we don't want students to feel like they belong. We don't want students to feel respected. We don't want students to feel heard. We want to be trauma indifferent. No school expresses that, But when we haven't done the work of evaluating our practice, when we haven't done the work of making sure that we are who we say we are, this is who we aspire to be, but who are we actually, you get that disconnect. And I think the key thing is, and I've really learned to probe, I've really learned to, get beneath that rhetoric at leadership level and actually sometimes have to present a bit of a picture to leaders that this is the reality on the ground, that some students don't feel like they belong. They don't feel like they've got a safe place. I remember speaking to a student panel in a particular school, and one of the students said, "Miss, if I'm honest, if I had a problem, I don't know who I'd go to." I mean, that is the epitome of safety. There is somebody I could talk to. If students are saying this, that I don't know who I'd talk to if I had a problem, that's massive for me. That's a safeguarding concern, So the implications are we end up practicing in a way where people are just making it up as they go along. We don't have, a shared vision. We have division,
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it takes courage, doesn't it, for leaders to consistently drill down to what's actually happening. It's really easy to kind of tick the boxes and say we've done these things and we've had these conversations and this is what's happening in our school. But actually the courage comes from consistently going back to staff, parents, carers, children, young people, and saying, is this the reality?
And I love the fact that you've mentioned that, Becky, because it's not a insignificant thing. It's not an insignificant thing when school leaders say, come in and have these conversations. I work with parents as well, and when parents jump on a call and they're exposing in some ways, they pulled the curtain right back and said, this is what's really going on. That for me is it's a very humbling experience, and there are many schools that have gone on the journey. There are many schools that bite that bullet, and there are many schools who go on that journey and it is just a process of reaffirming, wow, thank goodness we are who we say we are, For other schools, it's revelation. It is, wow, we thought, our hearts were in the right place. And, I've never met anybody who's doing anything wrong with intent, but we can be sincerely wrong. And I think we need to own the humanity that is bound up in the work that we do. We don't work with products, we work with people. People with all manner of, and I'm not just talking about students, I'm talking about colleagues, leaders, everybody in between. We're working at that whole human dynamic and that interaction day in, day out. I mean, sometimes you can't even get that right in your house, much less a community of like 1,000+ students and a staff body of multiple hundreds. It can just be like, what? So what I'm saying in essence is we've got to be intentional. And we've got to, as you say, periodically do those checks. And if you've got the infrastructure to do that internally, by all means, knock yourself out, But I love the fact you've mentioned courage, because it is about being courageous, and then doing the follow through with what emerges. And there are some schools we worked with for, over a year and a half, 2 years, because they've started that journey and, have unearthed things that they didn't realize were lying beneath and have been prepared to go on that journey. And I have to say, I really deeply respect the work that school leaders are doing anyway, much less when they say to, organizations like ours or others, come in and, help us to evaluate our practice, help us to see where we're getting it right, and we'll take the pat on the back, but similarly help us to see where we can improve. It's a very significant thing when we get invited across the threshold to do that kind of work.
And people see that. Children, young people see that, staff see that, they recognise that leaders are open to those conversations. I think that's really important as well, isn't it? Liva, you had a brilliant question. Our final question, I think, for today. It's a good one, Tracey. Hold on to your hat.
Of course. I just want to say, you guys mentioned in your conversations, you said that in schools there are also really good teachers. I can tell you the reason why I'm at university today is because I had a brilliant teacher who literally emphasized that they believed in me, that my story was not the definition of my future, and that I will make a difference in the world. There was more good teachers in my schools than bad teachers, and that's the honest truth and stuff. And we cannot define an entire institution based on the, let's say, the not so good parts of the school system, because there are more teachers who care than there are not. So I just want to say, as a living example, there are amazing teachers.
Thank you for that, Liva. That's so important.
The last question is a very important one to me, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Is a trauma-informed approach possible if we are excluding students? Does a zero tolerance approach work?
Ooh, okay, let me start with the latter part of your point about a zero tolerance approach. And the thing about a zero tolerance approach, I think it kind of needs to be nuanced a bit, right? Because on paper, a zero tolerance approach sounds like a zero tolerance approach, right? It sounds like, we never, have this particular thing happening. We've got our set of rules, and any kind of breach, the kind of sky comes in. So, but a zero tolerance approach for me is significantly problematic. Because it's very much a kind of a one size fits all type of approach to behavior. And no two students are the same, much less a group of students. And there are all sorts of reasons as to why, going back to those three groups that I talked about earlier on, the perfect, the predictable, the persistent, right? And, part of that whole trauma-informed piece of work is being able to have the skills to get beneath the behavior. It's being able to provide that emotional support. And what a zero tolerance approach does, in essence, is it categorizes behavior as simply rule breaking. Yeah. And when we only see misbehavior as rule breaking, there's a lot that we don't see. And I'm going to say that again because it's an important point. Yeah. When we only see misbehavior as rule breaking, there's a lot we don't see. We don't see distress. We don't see trauma. We don't see anxiety. We don't see fear. We don't see those things if we only see you are breaking a rule. Yeah. And there are ways that students have learnt to get their vital needs met. Needs for connection, need for safety, need for recognition, need for belonging. Yeah. And I can relate to that. I can relate to being a classic classroom clown, because I learned that through my humor, through my antics, I was able to connect with people in a way that met a need for me. It wasn't just rule breaking. It looked like rule breaking on the surface, but it was more than that. And I can totally relate to what Liba said in terms of that adult or those adults in her context that helped her to see that this is not all I contribute to school. I can contribute something positive. So I'm not an advocate of the zero tolerance approach. I think it's problematic. I think it doesn't leave you room to take into account the very complex needs that we've been talking about, Becky, that teachers are confronted with that. So that's the first thing about a zero tolerance approach. And I think the next thing is where it gets a bit more tricky, because I think I would love to be able to answer that question with a resounding, almost like a vote, as it were, in favor of a trauma-informed approach over exclusions, right? But I speak as a former teacher. I speak as somebody who has worked with hundreds, possibly even thousands of schools. And I know head teachers who they've never excluded a student. There's multiple head teachers that I know, right? And I think the challenge is, I don't think the sector is ready for a conversation about not excluding, because many schools do not have the infrastructure. They don't have the resources. They don't have the budget. They don't have the investment that is needed to be able to cater for some of the complexities that are coming across their threshold. So when I think about the schools and the head teachers that I know who categorically don't exclude, it's more than a principle. It's more than somebody showing up saying, I don't do this. They have got the infrastructure. They've got the processes, they've got key people in key places. I mean, there's a particular head teacher that I'm thinking of, and I spent a day in her school just work shadowing the behavior team. Yeah. And I mean, at 8 o'clock, you've got people on the gate meeting students, meeting some of those real vulnerable families and those vulnerable students, making sure, checking in, how you doing, plugging them into Breakfast Club. And I mean, there was not an adult in that building that was not involved. Even the premises officer, was involved in being able to respond to students in distress. So I would love to say, I wish I could say, no, we should not have a policy where children are being excluded. I'll be honest with you, I as somebody who I've never been permanently excluded, I've been suspended 6 times. it can feel like a very damaging process, just that sense of rejection from the school. So it almost feels like exclusion is everything that trauma-informed practice isn't. Does that make sense? It's almost like the two things can't coexist. But I think we're not there yet. There are schools who, and some of the conversations that I end up being a part of, who genuinely feel they have come to the end of themselves, that they can't keep the student safe, the student in question. They can't keep the wider school community safe, and they've had to make that very, very tough decision. Again, being really honest, yes, is exclusion overused? I have to say yes, in my experience. There are schools who overuse it, and whether it's exclusions or managed moves or suspensions, or there are schools and that overuse that process. But I would love to, if we ever do this again, Becky, have a conversation at a later date where I think schools are better resourced to be able to do the trauma-informed work that many people are doing under some very difficult circumstances, and many people want to do more effectively, but in many respects their hands are tied because they simply don't have the resources to be able to. Sometimes it comes down to safety, keep themselves safe or keep students safe, so Laiba, do let me know if that is an answer to your question.
Well, most definitely is. I think you've covered such a key point that I wish we could, but realistically we couldn't. Because school exclusions kind of run on we need to keep the other students safe as well, and that's why some kids get excluded. And I think one of the most hardest things for me was when my teacher would say, I don't want to exclude you, but I have to. And I was thinking, why then? Why are you doing it? Like, I didn't do this on purpose. I was having a trauma response. I was triggered. That's why I behaved that way. I don't want to, but I have to. That stuck with me my whole life, even to this day. It's stuck with me.
Wow.
Because it shows the helplessness of a teacher, but it also shows the bigger message behind it. Rules are rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just one thing to say off the back of that is I remember when I was, can't remember if I was a teacher or a school leader at the time, but we were scheduled to have some restraint training. Yeah. And I remember feeling really just uneasy about this idea of learning how to hold people's kids. I just felt really uneasy about that. And I remember feeling so relieved when we had the training was a whole day. And the first half of the day, we were actually in a classroom. I'm thinking we're going to be in this big hall. We're going to be paired up and I'm learning how to hold you and you're learning how to hold me. But the first half of the training was in a classroom because the majority of the day was spent talking about de-escalation. It was spent talking about how do we respond to students who are in distress, and all of that, everything that has kind of been the theme of this conversation around, not just seeing students who are breaking rules, but seeing students who are communicating a deeper need for something else. Yeah. And I think that's what, Laiba, it boils down to, that, I don't think we can eradicate exclusions, but I think we could significantly reduce exclusions if more people had, the emotional awareness, whether it's emotional coaching, whether it's just being able to provide that co-regulation. And I'm kind of going to end where I began, with that whole recognition that behavior is a coin that has two sides. Behavior is about adults and behavior is about children. And if we could just, at the very least, ensure that our staff teams are upskilled and have just the fundamental, knowledge and skills needed to be able to come alongside a student in a moment of distress. And sometimes it's about the eyes through which we look and see. And it can be very hard. Let's be honest. It can be very hard to see a student's vulnerability in the midst of their bravado, right? When they're saying, oh, shut up, man. Oh, I don't even care. Yeah. It's very hard to look at that and say, oh, there's some distress there, because you're thinking, well, who do you think you're talking to?
Pressing all the buttons.
Do you understand what I mean? It takes, skill and knowledge to actually be able to decode that in that moment, to take a minute, pause, manage your own emotion and respond in a way that de-escalates for real. And I say de-escalates for real because many people think they're doing de-escalation, but I'm sorry, they're not. De-escalation is our capacity to manage our default response in a challenging moment.
De-escalation starts with de-escalating ourselves, doesn't it?
Exactly. And yeah, we've got a way to go, shall we say?
Well, that, I think, is podcast number 2 with Tracey Campbell.
Yeah.
De-escalation. Let's put that on the
Let's
bill
do
in the
that.
future.
Let's
Awesome.
do that. Let's do
Well,
that.
listen, we've come to the end of our time, Tracey. Thank you so much. We always end with sharing is caring. What are we recommending? Is there anything that people can go away? We're going to share all your socials so people can follow you and find out about your work. Anything else you would recommend people kind of engaging with after this conversation?
I would say, I would really encourage people to engage with an organisation called Class 13. So the CEO of which is Curtis Worrell. They're doing a really phenomenal piece of work around not just around the need for trauma-informed and equity-centered schools, and really challenging some of the deficit ideologies that underpin the approaches that are used in schools around behaviour, policy and practice. So I would really encourage practitioners to log in, have a little look at what Class 13, Curtis Worrell and his team are doing around equity-centered and trauma-informed approaches in school. Yeah,
because that's again a whole other issue, isn't it, about the young people that are disproportionately affected by behaviour policies. Yeah, we're talking about young Black men are disproportionately affected by exclusion. So many different intersectional challenges that it really, as school leaders, we need to be reflecting on and thinking about what we're doing in our practice. So yeah, Class 13 sounds brilliant.
Class 13, absolutely.
So thank you so much, Tracey. Thank you so much, Liba. Don't forget to drop us an email if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, or want to share some of the brilliant work that you're doing for wellbeing in your setting. Just email us at teamwellbeing@twinkl.co.uk. Thank you very much and see you next time.